All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about with regards to software architecture is something called state management. Now, state management is a very important part of virtually any web application, and it can have pretty profound implications on how we actually organize our code. So first of all, let's start off by talking about what state management is exactly. The definition that I've come up with for state management is basically how our application handles the data needs of its components with regards to loading, storing, persisting, and sharing this data. Now, that's a pretty broad definition, and that's by design because the concerns of state management tend to be quite broad themselves. So moving on to different state management technologies, most of you have probably had at least some experience with some of these technologies before. Maybe some of you have heard of all of these. The main state management technologies that we're going to be looking at in this course are the useState hook and context, which are what I refer to as sort of the vanilla React state management tools, right? You don't need to import any other libraries besides React for these. And we're also going to be taking a look at Recoil, Redux, and MobX, which are three of the most popular state management technologies in the React world. Now, before we jump into that, though, I want to point out something that I think of as different sizes of state. Basically, the different state management tools that are available to us work on different scales in our application. So one question that I get quite a lot about these different technologies is how do we choose between them? Well, the main criteria that I look at when choosing a state management tool are the size and complexity of the application that I'm working on. Is it going to be just a simple blog application, or is it going to be a full-scale e-commerce site? And related to this, I also look at how many components are going to need to share the data that our application contains. So is the data that we're loading from the server just going to be used in a single component, or is it going to be used across our entire site? And last but not least, I take a look at the unique strengths and weaknesses of each. This is something that we'll see when we actually implement each of these tools in React. But before we move on to that, let's talk about something that I refer to as different sizes of state. Basically, this idea is related to what I just mentioned, and it refers to the fact that our different state management tools work on different scales in our application. So on one side of the spectrum, we have what I refer to as small state, that is, state that really deals with just very small atomic pieces of data that we want to deal with. And that's usually taken care of by the vanilla React state management tools useState and context. Moving up, then, we have medium state. This is generally state that applies to a smaller subset of the components in our application, but needs to be shared between them fairly regularly. And on the larger end of the spectrum, we have Redux and MobX, which specialize in handling state that is required by a large number of components and is generally part of a large application. And that's basically the spectrum of state sizes. Again, we're going to see how this all applies when we take a look at each of these tools in turn. All right, so the first state management tool that we're going to take a look at is the vanilla React useState hook. Now, most of you are probably already familiar with this useState hook, but I'm just going to implement something here so that we have a good point of reference for the rest of the technologies that we're going to take a look at. So the example that we're going to be implementing here is just a basic counter button that keeps track of how many times it's been clicked. Now, I understand that this is not the most exciting example, but again, it provides a fantastic point of reference for seeing how different state management libraries handle things. So what we're going to do is create a new component inside our directory here. And by the way, you can get this project from the exercise files. It's just a stripped down version of the Create React app without any of the boilerplate code in the app component. So let's create a new file inside our source directory here, which we'll call counterbutton.js. And let's start implementing our component here. So the first thing we're going to do is import the useState hook from React. Remember that since this is just a so-called vanilla React state management tool, we don't need to import any other libraries. And then we're going to define our counter button component by saying export const counter button. And our component's going to be fairly simple. It's just going to contain a paragraph tag that tells us how many times the button has been clicked. So we'll say, you have clicked the button, and we'll insert a value there once we have it, and we'll say times. And then underneath that, we're going to have the button, which will just say click. Okay, so let's wrap both these elements in a fragment. And let's define our state now. Okay, so again, most of you are probably familiar with what this looks like. We're going to say const, and we'll call our state number of clicks. And we'll say set number of clicks equals useState, and the initial value of this state is going to be 0. So all we have to do now is pass this number of clicks state variable. Inside of here, we're going to say number of clicks times. And for our button, we'll make it actually increment the number of clicks by saying onClick equals, and we'll say set number of clicks to number of clicks plus 1. And that's pretty much all we need to do. So let's display this counter button in our app component. We're going to just import it up at the top. We'll say import counter button from counter button. And down here, we'll display it underneath our state management example heading. So we'll just say counter button like that. And of course, we need to wrap both of these in a fragment as well. Okay, so if we take a look at our application, and you're going to need to run that by saying npm run start if you haven't already, we see that if we click on the button now, it keeps track of how many times we've clicked it. Pretty straightforward, right? Let's just add one more feature to our counter button component. We're going to add an input that allows the user to change the number that we increment the count by every time the button is clicked. So that's going to be pretty simple. We just need to add another state variable, and we'll say const. We'll call this state variable increment by, and set increment by. And the default value for that is going to be 1. Okay, and then above our button, we're going to add a label here. Inside there, we'll say something like increment by, and we'll have an input that keeps track of this increment by variable. So this input will have the value equal to our increment by state. It'll have an onChange function that basically sets the value of increment by to the value in the input. So we'll say set increment by to e.target.value, and we're going to need to convert that to a number as well in order for this to work properly. So we'll say number like that. And last but not least, we just want to set this to a number input. So we'll say type equals number. All right, and other than that, we just need to change our buttons on click method to say number of clicks plus increment by. And we should be good to go. So let's give this a try. We're going to say click, and we see that it increments it by 1. And if we change this to another number like 5, we'll see that it increments it by 5 instead. So that's how to create a basic counter button component using Vanilla React's useState hook. And again, this isn't the most exciting example, but it's going to give us a great jumping off point for the rest of the technologies we're going to be looking at. Okay, so the next state management tool that we're going to take a look at is context. Now, before we start looking at how context works, let's take a look at why it exists in the first place. Context exists to solve one of the main problems with the useState hook, and that is, how do we let our components share state without having to pass the data around as props all the time? So in other words, if we wanted our counter button to share state with some other component, let's say that we wanted to have 2 counter button components in our application and have them share their state, what we would have to do is actually lift this state up into the app component, or whatever the parent component of both our counter button components were. And then we'd have to pass down the state as well as these set number of clicks functions as props to each of our counter button components. Now, if that sounds like a little bit of a hassle, it often is. especially when you have to pass those props through several layers of components. This is something that's become known as props drilling. So basically, the point of context, and what we're going to take a look at here, is that it allows components to share state without having to basically pass that state as props. So let's take a look at what context looks like, but first, let's remove these useState hooks from our counter button component. We're just going to get rid of them, and get rid of this. And there's going to be a few errors for now, but we'll come back and correct those once we implement our context. So the first thing that we need in order to implement our state as context is a context for the given piece of data that we want to implement. So what we're going to do is create a new file, which we'll call countercontext.js. And here's what this is going to look like. We're going to say import, and we're going to import something called createContext from React. So context is another vanilla React tool. And we're just going to say export const counter context equals create context. All right, so that's all this file has to look like. Basically, what our components are going to be able to do later on is import this context and get its current value. So now that we have the context, the next thing we're going to need is a provider. A provider basically defines a section of the DOM where the components inside of it will be able to access a given value for the context. So let's create a new file, which we'll call counterprovider.js. And our provider is going to be its own component. So what we're going to do is we're going to say import useState from React, and we're going to say import countercontext from countercontext. Now, it might seem strange to you that we're importing useState into our counter provider, but this is actually necessary most of the time when we're dealing with providers and context, right? Basically, we're going to use useState to keep track of the current value of our count, and the provider basically just allows the components inside of it to access that value. So let's define our component now. We're going to say export const counter provider. And we're going to say children. We're going to get access to the children prop here. And what we're going to do is say const number of clicks and set number of clicks equals useState, and the initial value there, of course, is going to be 0. So let's also define a function for incrementing this number of clicks. We'll say const increment equals amount. And inside here, we'll say set number of clicks to number of clicks plus 1. And then what we're going to do is just say return. And we're going to return the counter context's provider. So the context that we created inside of here automatically has its own provider component that we can access. So here's what that means. We're going to say counter context dot provider, and we pass the value to this provider, which is just going to be our number of clicks. Okay, and then we display all of the children inside of it. So what we did inside this counter provider is basically just encapsulated the state of our number of clicks. Oh, and one more thing we're going to want to do is, in order to give our components access to this increment function, we have to actually pass that as part of the value as well. So what we're going to do is actually pass an object as the value here with number of clicks and increment. Okay. And now that we have our counter provider defined, we're going to go into our app component and wrap all of our app components that we want to be able to access the value. Generally, that will just be the entire DOM. So instead of having this fragment here, we can just say counter provider. And you can see that it automatically imported that for me up at the top here. And we'll close that tag down here and adjust the indentation. So at this point, we're providing the context to any component inside of this provider that wants it. So what we're going to do is open up our counter button component now and allow it to access the value of that context. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to start off by saying import useContext from React, and we're going to import our counter context. We'll say import counter context from counter context. All right, and now we're going to use this useContext hook in conjunction with our counter context to get the current value of this useState hook inside our counter provider. So here's what that'll look like. We're going to say const, and we're going to use object destructuring here to get both the number of clicks and the increment function. And we'll say equals useContext and pass the counter context as an argument. Okay. Now we'll get to this increment by thing in a second. Let's just comment that out for now. And instead of calling set number of clicks in our onClick method here, we're going to say increment. All right, so we're just calling that function that our provider gives us. So that should be all we need to do for now. Let's give this a try. Let's click on the button, and we see that just like before, it's keeping track of how many times we've clicked the button. So one last thing that you're probably wondering is how do we implement the increment by thing with our context? Well, basically, all we need to do there is go back into our counter provider and add a state variable for it. So we're going to say const increment by and set increment by equals useState, and the initial value for this will be 1. And then we're going to set this, instead of number of clicks plus 1, to number of clicks plus increment by. And then we're going to pass both the increment by value and the set increment by function to this value as part of the object. So we'll say increment by and set increment by. And then inside our counter button component now, we just have to add increment by and set increment by to our object destructuring here. And now we can uncomment this part of the DOM, and we should be good to go. Let's give it a test. So if we change this to 5 and click here, we'll see that it now increments by 5. Right? And if we change that to another number, of course, it will do the same thing. So one thing that I want to point out about the context here is that you generally want to avoid adding things to it that you don't need. In the case of our counter button here, basically the increment by really should be something that it handles itself, since that's the value of one of the inputs that it contains. In general, we want to make sure that we only put things into the context that need to be shared by multiple components. So what we would probably want to do instead of this is have increment by and set increment by use the useState hook, which we can do fairly simply. We'll just say useState, change this to const increment by and set increment by equals useState, default value 1. And then we just need to make this increment function take an argument that tells it how much to increment the count. So what this is going to look like is we're going to say increment by, and then inside of our counter provider, we're going to remove increment by and make that the argument of this function. So we'll say increment by, and there we go. So now we just need to remove these other two properties from our value. And we're done. Let's give it a test. So we're going to say increment by, change that to something like 4, and click on this, and we see that it works perfectly well. Okay, the next state management tool that we're going to take a look at is called Recoil. Now, Recoil is a fairly new player in the state management world. It was created as a way to help us manage the state of larger applications while still making things like code splitting fairly easy to do. Now, I'm not going to go into too much depth on things like code splitting, but what we are going to do is use Recoil to re-implement our counter button example, and this will allow us to see some of its core concepts. So let's head back to our counter button example. And what we're going to do is rewrite our counter button so that it uses recoil instead of context, which is the last one that we looked at. So the first step in integrating recoil, since recoil is not included by default with the React library, the first thing we have to do is install it. So we're going to say npm install recoil in our project. And once we've installed it, we're going to go into our app component. And part of the way that Recoil works is very similar to how we worked with providers earlier. Basically, instead of having a provider for a single state, we wrap our entire application in something called a Recoil root. So let's start off by importing that up here at the top. We're going to say import Recoil root from Recoil. And then instead of wrapping our entire application in a counter provider, we just have to wrap it in this recoil root component. Okay, so what this recoil root thing will do is it'll keep track of all of the recoil states in our application and allow our components inside of the recoil root to access their values. So we can also remove this counter provider thing for now. So now that we have the recoil root, the next thing we're going to do is create the states for recoil. Now, recoil has two main concepts, and those are atoms and selectors. Atoms are individual values that we want to store in our recoil state. So we're going to create two atoms here. One is going to be the state for the number of clicks. So we'll say counter state here, .js. And we're going to create another one too, that will be the increment by state. So we'll say increment by state.js. And let's start off with our counter state. What we're going to do is we're going to start off by importing something called atom from recoil. This atom is a function that we call to create new pieces of the recoil state, to define new values that we want to store there. And then we're simply going to say export const counter state equals atom. And we pass a configuration object here that's going to contain the key of the counter state. This is basically the string that recoil uses to store this state behind the scenes. We usually just call it the same thing as what we defined the constant as up here. And then we're going to say default 0. And this is the default value for our counter state. And that's what a basic atom looks like. Let's do the same thing for our increment by state. We're basically just going to copy and paste this into there and change the name of this to increment by state and the key to increment by state as well. And then we're going to change the default value here to 1. Okay. All right, and now that we have those two states defined, basically what this is going to look like is we're going to open up our counter button component. And instead of using the useContext and useState hook, we're going to use a special hook provided by Recoil, which is called useRecoilState. Okay, so what this is going to look like, we're going to say import useRecoilState from Recoil. And then what we're going to do is import those two atoms that we just defined. So down here, we're going to say import counter state from counter state and import increment by state from increment by state. Okay. And the next thing we're going to do is rewrite this useContext thing. We're just going to replace it with const number of clicks, set number of clicks equals useRecoilState, and we're going to pass our counter state to this. And what this will do is it'll basically create a state that's very similar to our React useState hook, except it can be shared by multiple components without passing the state as props. So in that way, it's very similar to context. And then we're going to change this set increment by thing to use recoil state as well. And we're going to change that value to increment by state. And then we need to go back and change this increment by thing back to, say, set number of clicks to number of clicks plus increment by. All right, so if we go and check our application now, see if it runs, we should see that if we click the button, it increments it by the correct amount. So Recoil is working behind the scenes now. All right, and let's open up our application. You may need to run it again after installing Recoil. And we should see that this works just like before, except now it's using Recoil behind the scenes.